Hi. Today I want to speak with you about Paul and the Jesus tradition. The content of this lecture is intended to help you answer two of the four questions in discussion board 3, namely question 1, in which you are asked to distinguish between those aspects of Paul's theology which he derived from traditional sources, and by that I mean through conversations with the first Jewish leaders of the early church, Simon, Peter, and James, and the like, and those he derived from direct revelation, and by that I mean, of course, his Damascus Road experience, as well as question 2 in this discussion board, in which you are asked to compare and contrast elements of Paul's theology with the information found in the four Gospels, both in terms of where there is convergence or agreement with the Gospels and where there is divergence or disagreement from the Gospels. Now, the larger issue at stake in these two questions is this: did Paul know about the Jesus tradition as it is preserved in the four Gospels? That's the question. One of the reasons we raise that question is that Paul's letters have precious little information in them about the historical Jesus, the Jesus who is revealed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Indeed, if we only had Paul's letters and we did not have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we would know very little about the historical Jesus. And so one of the major purposes of discussion board 3 is to require you to reflect on this central issue a bit more deeply. What did Paul know about the historical Jesus? And where did he get his information? First of all, an overview. The differences between Paul, the letters of Paul, and the Gospels can be accounted for on the basis of two things, chiefly. Paul never knew the historical Jesus. Unlike Simon Peter or Matthew, Paul's experience with Jesus was with the risen Christ exclusively. And so we needn't expect Paul to have as much information, first-hand information about the historical Jesus as did the apostles who were numbered with Jesus' company and were a part of Jesus' traveling companions. And then secondly, Paul's preaching, his proclamation, centered on the cross and the resurrection, not on the life and ministry of Jesus. But that said, there are both divergences and convergences with the Jesus tradition and the letters of Paul. Let's look at some areas of divergence first. The parables of Jesus, so important in the gospel tradition, the teaching of Jesus in which he captures the essence of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is like, and then Jesus starts telling stories about the nature of the kingdom of God, stories we call parables. Paul never mentions any of the parables, and only 5 times in his letters does he ever allude to or mention the kingdom of God. Jesus' miracles, his healing miracles, his nature miracles, Paul never mentions them. Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River, never mentioned in Paul. Jesus' temptation on the high mountain with Peter, James, and John, the inner circle of disciples present. Not a word in the letters of Paul. Jesus' Galilean ministry, calling of the disciples and making Capernaum his home base and his proclamation around the northern part of the lake. Again, not a word in Paul's letters. Jesus' transfiguration with Peter, James, and John present. Again, not a word about that in Paul's letters. And then Jesus' final journey to Jerusalem, a major section in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 9, verse 51, all the way through 18:14. A major part of the Gospel of Luke, Paul never mentions it. But there are some areas of convergence as well, where Paul and the Jesus tradition, as preserved in the Gospels, cover the same ground. Duke University's Richard Hayes, in his doctoral dissertation, points to what he calls a narrative substructure of the Jesus tradition in the letters of Paul. He makes the case in his dissertation that though Paul does not give us extensive information about the Jesus tradition and the events of the historical Jesus, everywhere in Paul's letters he assumes a knowledge of that. I don't know, some scholars have embraced that thesis, others have not, but it is an intriguing point to consider. Maybe Paul doesn't retrace the same ground as the Gospels because he doesn't feel he has to. He assumes a knowledge of the historical Jesus. Be that as it may, F. Bruce in your reading points out some areas of incidental, what he calls incidental contact between Paul and the Jesus tradition. Marriage and divorce. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 and following, to the married I give charge, not I but the Lord, that is, he's quoting the Lord, quoting the Jesus tradition, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, let her remain single or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband should not divorce his wife. Very, very similar to what Jesus says in Mark chapter 10. Again, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 14 and following, that a laborer is worthy of the wage he earns. Almost exactly what Jesus says in Matthew 10. Again, eat what is set before you. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 makes that point when he is saying that when believers are in the presence of unbelievers, he says, if one of the unbelievers invites you to his home for dinner and you are disposed to go, eat what is set before you. Now, that's very important for Jews who had kosher eating practices when they sat down with pagans, with Gentiles who didn't eat kosher. Paul says the same thing Jesus does in Luke chapter 10 when he sends his disciples out. It is the essence of hospitality, even if you are a kosher Jew, to eat what is set before you. So don't be rude. Observe the rules and principles of hospitality. Don't say, oh, I don't eat that because, I'm a Jew and I eat kosher. So again, Paul and Jesus covering the same ground. And then tribute to whom tribute is due. Both Paul in Romans 13 and Jesus in Mark 12, in the conversation about paying taxes to Caesar in Mark, and Paul saying, give respect to the governor, because even though we are citizens of the kingdom of God, we're still in the world. And though we are not of the world, we are in the world, and therefore we should give tribute to whom tribute is due. So there are areas, Bruce discusses them in your reading, where even though Paul doesn't cover the same ground as the Gospels do in terms of giving us information about the historical Jesus, he does allude to some of the same things Jesus talks about in the four Gospels. Finally, some additional thoughts on marriage and divorce. One part of your question this week said, give a summary of one element of contact between Paul and Jesus and how it can be applied to Christians today. I wanted to talk about marriage and divorce, what both Paul and Jesus say about marriage and divorce. C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, I paused to drop a footnote, save Jesus of Nazareth, no one has influenced me more than C.S. Lewis. And in his little book, Mere Christianity, he discusses the Christian ethics. He does it under two categories, the 7 deadly sins like pride and so forth, things we are to avoid, sloth, and then what he calls the 7 lively virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues, justice, temperance, prudence, and courage, and the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And so he talks about marriage in his discussion of Christian ethics. One would think that he would talk about marriage under the virtue of love, but he doesn't. He discusses marriage under the virtue of justice, not love. Why? Well, because Lewis argues that marriage is an exercise of the virtue of justice, not love, because marriage is at bottom keeping promises. We make promises, we stand before God and the people of God and make promises. We are to keep those promises. Lewis goes on to say there are 2 views of marriage. One is the secular, the pagan view. Marriage is a social contract. 2 people come together and pool their resources and say, we'll continue to stay together so long as it's mutually beneficial. But when it's no longer mutually beneficial, we'll just sever the contract and go our separate ways. But that's not the Christian view of marriage. The Christian view of marriage is 2 people come together and form a new thing Jesus called one flesh. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they being 2 shall be one flesh. Jesus quoting Genesis chapter 1. 2 people coming together and becoming a new thing, neither could have been apart from the other. Now, if that's the case, then, Lewis argues, there are two different views of divorce. The secular view of divorce is we just break a contract. No harm, no foul. It's no longer beneficial. We just sever the contract and go our separate ways. But if you believe in the Christian view of marriage, one flesh, two people coming together and becoming a new thing, one flesh, how do you dissolve one flesh without destroying it? The Christian view is not just breaking a contract. The Christian view of divorce is the dissolution of one flesh. It's more akin to the amputation of both legs than breaking a contract. Now, sometimes you may have to amputate both legs to save the patient's life, but it's dramatic and it's disastrous and it's drastic, and you carry the scars the rest of your life. That's the Christian view of divorce. And so it leaves us with a question then, doesn't it? Given those two views of marriage and those two views of divorce, I would raise the question, does the church today really articulate and champion a Christian view of marriage and divorce? Worth considering, isn't it? Well, I hope this is a helpful exercise and that this lecture has been helpful to you as you prepare your answers to the questions raised by Discussion Board 3. Till next time, take care. God bless.